Hi folks, you're with Tastus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about this globalist activist, white hating, or the hatred of white people, and anti-colonialism and all this sort of stuff, and decolonizing, all this insane, ridiculous propaganda, which is 99.9% lies, about the sort of profits that were made by the colonial empires, and that those allegedly, and this is what they claim, those huge profits made white countries rich, and they're still rich today, and thus there's reparations due and repayments due. And now let's just have a look at how much money was really made from colonies, and the understanding of the role colonies played in the wider geopolitics of the time. In fact, still do, even to some extent, certainly from a geopolitical perspective. But just focusing on the profits. Now, the number one claim is slavery, this supposed free labor. That's what made all these colonial empires rich. Well, if that's the case, then Africa, that had more slaves per capita than anywhere in the world, all of Africa would have been filthy rich because of all the slaves they had. But was Africa rich then or now? Even today, Africa has more slaves than any other part of the world. Why are all the African countries not rich? So this claim that slavery, the free labor from slavery made those colonial empires rich is or was the sole or primary cause of those riches, is nonsense. Because if it was so, then any country in the world that has lots of cheap labor would also be rich. So India would be filthy rich per capita, Pakistan, Bangladesh, all these places that are dirt poor, basket case dirt poor, they would be rich because of all the cheap labor and all the slave labor that they have. Again, why is Africa not rich today, given all the slaves that are there? So slavery clearly is not the issue, and that can be dismissed out of hand. It surprises me, and I've looked at some talk shows where these activists get on, and the interviewers don't even push back slightly. They don't say, well, so you're saying slavery was the cause of the profit, and you can lead them in, yes, that's right, slavery, evil, far right now. Okay, so Africa has more slaves today, has had masses of slaves then and now, and yet why are they not rich? Can you answer that? If slavery is the issue, then why are they not rich? And you could nail them every time just with that simple question. But anyway, let's come back to so slavery clearly wasn't it. Now, I've had a look at got closer and had a look at the few calculations that are used by the globalist propagandists to justify social division between white and black, and to justify reparations, these sorts of things. Again, an issue that they use to create social division. So now, one place, this is an island that they were talking about. These had sugar and tobacco plantations on. This is an island where they found the three biggest plantations that were doing okay, and one of the biggest one in particular was quite very profitable, and this was initially with sugar. And what they're sort of forgetting a few things here and ignoring a few things. Firstly, out of the 100 plantations on this island, there are only 3 that were making good profits. There were 25, 30 that were doing all right, and the rest were marginal. If they're having a good year, it'd be okay. If the season was perfect, there were no monsoons or something like that. So a lot of doors had to line up. And so there's a lot of farmers there on marginal land that were not doing okay. So if you looked at the sugar plantation farming in total, it didn't really make any money if you consider all the plantations. But the propagandists, they found these 2 or 3 that were making good money, and they focus now and say, well, that's the baseline. Well, where it's not. It's nowhere near the baseline. And there's a few other things that they're not sort of counting in here. firstly, this particular island was French, and the French government put in at the French government's expense, by the way, not at the plantation owners' expense. They put in port facilities, warehouse and storage facilities. Remember, they're in the middle of nowhere, so this is not an inexpensive business. They build a fort there to protect the island from marauders and pirates and goons and so on. And they also put in sugar refining facilities there, so it can be turned. The sugar cane can be turned, liquefied, if you will, or even turned into actual sugar. So they've got all the facilities there. That's all very expensive. A lot of that, every bit of it, pretty much has to be imported from France, where it's made, and the government takes up the expense on that. So that's quite a lot of infrastructure. Then the roads are being built to move stuff around. Again, a lot of expense, time, and infrastructure, and so on. So some of these slaves are really involved in building that infrastructure rather than making profits for the owner. The owner will subsequently profit, if you like, from the roads and the ports and the other stuff. But that infrastructure still has to be put in place, and it wouldn't have been done unless white people were involved, and it was white technology and ingenuity that was involved in that. So so the expertise, the intellectual property, all that sort of stuff is all brought to the table by the white people. But anyway, just having a look at that, they focus just on the most profitable and the second most profitable, which are the largest plantations, and the ones that have direct access to the refining and the best access to the port facilities. The people on the other side, the farmers on the other side of the island that have to move their stuff around, they can't afford the refining infrastructure, so they have to subcontract out and pay the other guys to do. Their profit margins are much less, and again, they can be wiped out with a monsoon or bad weather or something like that, particularly heavy rainfall and so on. So they're very much exposed to the elements, and some of the land they have is quite marginal. So when they look at that, in fact, the benefit to in this island, the benefit to France there was negative, given the money they put into it and the profits generated in total. Then it was actually a loss-making enterprise. But because the activists and the propagandists, they just focus on the most profitable farm or sugarcane in this instance, then they're able to, look at this, look at all the money they made. But that's not true, and they ignore the investment made in the island in terms of putting in refining facilities, port facilities, and warehousing, and so on. So they play a double game here. They very, very much cherry pick. They ignore the expenses, look at only the profits, and again, they pick the juiciest, most profitable one to say, well, there you go, look at that. That just shows. And now there were a lot of slaves employed on that particular plantation, but there were basic reasons for that. White people didn't survive that sort of climate very well, so the local Indians were succumbing to white diseases and were considered as completely unreliable workers, and so and would run off at every opportunity. So the only people you could find anywhere in the world that could work in those conditions were the black people from Africa, and the black tribes there, and the tribal chieftains were queuing up, as the Arab slave traders were queuing up, gagging to sell their fellow countrymen, the other black people, to the white colonialists who would transport them to those plantations. Now, it's hard to find any ongoing example of anything other than brief periods of profit that were as a result of colonialism. I guess there are two sort of wider issues here. The idea of capturing an island or taking an island or a continent or part of a continent or whatever was not per se trade, although that certainly was part of it. It was to forestall one of your rivals. So say the British would take an island in the Caribbean, say, and it wasn't because they necessarily wanted that island or really needed it in the overall scheme of things. it was to stop the French or the Spanish or the whoever from establishing a base there, and that base could be used to harass British traders that were trading elsewhere around the area or through that region. So it was also an area to put revictualling, so that if a British ship was running short on supplies or needed to shelter from a storm or something like that, they could come into the harbour, and so there was a lot of ships were lost at sea because the ship was damaged in a storm and couldn't find anywhere to go, and so eventually was sank just from lack of ability to find a port and access repair facilities. So there were those sorts of things. Now, so it was a projection of power. It was trading, and it was particularly forestalling your enemies, because if a rival power again got that island, they could use that as a base to harass your commerce, and so you're preventing that. So there's a lot of reasons why that was done. India is a case in point. There was a French and Dutch and Portuguese trading posts there, and the French were particularly trying to increase their influence. The British thought that was a bad move if the French would become dominant in the area, because then they could harass British traders to China and Australia and all that sort of thing, or later on Australia, not in the earlier stages. So they thought, well, we'll forestall that, but was it profitable and so on? Now I noticed when the only one paper that these globalist activists have done, in fact they turned it into one of these full of lies documentaries that the globalist activists love to put out and that are given primetime viewing in schools and so on, is that they look at the investment the British Empire made in India, and then they just pivot around on that and say that was the profit that was extracted. So when the investment the British made in India was in the billions of pounds sterling. Everything from ports and storage, later on railways, roads, all manner of infrastructure was put in, and it cost a fucking fortune. Not that they didn't, also make money out of it. They did, but that they looked at that cost that the British went to and said, "Oh, that was the profit." So they tell a blatant lie and say that £5 billion was really £5 billion of profit, not £5 billion of costs. So it's easy to pick through this, and it looks like it was all put together by some little punk blue-haired activist intern that was absolutely focused on making the British or the white people of the empire look bad, no matter how many lies they had to tell to do it, and the lies are thick and fast. So they certainly play around with the numbers there. When you look at the totality of cost, this is in purely commercial terms, the cost of maintaining the colonial empire, whether it be French Empire or British Empire, Spanish Empire. You look at the cost of maintaining it, and also the indirect cost. The military cost of the British government constantly having to send expensive fleets of ships around the place with soldiers on it, and making demonstrations along the coastline to show any local heavy tribal chieftain, do what we say, otherwise we're going to blow the crap out. That's all very expensive. Now it doesn't appear on the ledgers, if you like, of the colonial enterprise or business enterprise, East India Company, whatever it might be. But those are costs that the nation, the taxpayer, had to bear in support of this. Now, other things were related to profitability, was more to do with creating monopolies and so on. For example, the British would take cotton from India, they turn it into fabric or clothing in the cotton mills of Britain, using the latest technology, the spinning jenny, all that sort of stuff. And they would turn that into fabric or clothing and then export it back to India. So taking in the raw material, the raw cotton that is, and turning it into clothing. So this put a lot of the Indian weavers out of work, and they were sort of a class of their own there. But and this had resistance, but the Indian weavers couldn't match the price, even though the cost of labour, even back then, was about 1/5 of what it was in Britain. Because Britain had automated, mechanised, through the Industrial Revolution, they could still produce fabric at half the price that a weaver could, even though the weaver was on 1/5 of the wage that a British weaver or operator of the weaving machinery was on. So an interesting sort of differential there in economics back in the day. We're talking early 1800s here. So by creating an effective monopoly, due to the efficiency of the the efficiencies created by the Industrial Revolution, the British were able to establish almost monopoly conditions in the places like India, but elsewhere, to sell. So that was the primary source of the profits. The Industrial Revolution and the price and quality advantage that mechanized industrial production gave to the British. That was the source of their profit, not of the colonial empire itself. And this is something that the globalist activists don't separate. They just say, well, the profit was made. Okay, well, sure, why? Oh, because of colonialism, because of slavery. No. It's because of none of those things. It was actually because of efficiency in production and so on. So when you look at this cost of empire, the empires, the colonial empires, weren't particularly profitable. Now, some did quite well out of it. The Dutch did quite well out of the East Indies there for a while, what today is Indonesia. They did fairly well out of that. And, if you look at but even the Dutch sort of made the point that if they have to sort of do a full-on occupation of the islands, the Spice Islands as they were first known, then the cost would outweigh any benefit they could get from trading. So how do you make these colonies pay? You can't afford to put in huge military infrastructure. You can't afford to have a garrison in every town with a fort in every town. It just isn't going to work. The cost would by far and away outstrip any benefit. So they had to do it on a relatively shoestring budget in order for them not to be losing money hand over fist. That in itself is a very clear indication that empires and colonial empires were not super profitable. They're only profitable if you did a shoestring sort of budget on the management of it. And to do that, you had to get, at least to some extent, a buy-in from the locals. So the African chieftains were more than happy to sell black Africans as slaves, gagging, queuing up to do it. So this idea that it was evil whites rampaging Africa and grabbing black people at random is just bullshit. The other thing too about slavery, I've seen graphics of drawings of African slaves being jam-packed in. I mean, sardines have more room. Sardine can has more room in it than these graphics. So it depicts a relatively small vessel that has nearly 200 African slaves put together. Now, remember the voyage. The voyage lasts for, depending on the weather, can last for a couple of months. If all weather's good and everything goes, you can do it in weeks, but it's typically going to be months. And if you've got that many people packed in that tightly, the casualty rates would be massive. We'd be looking at 50, 60, 70% casualty rates. Just the amount of food that you'd need to carry to feed that many people. So now, if you look at the price that the slave traders would pay in the West African ports and the price that they would get in, say, North America as an example, then the cost of transporting, the cost of the ship, the food and all the other, the crew and upkeep of the ship. Upkeep was pretty expensive on those ships. So if you look at all the cost of that, now the ship has to sail to Africa, and you've got to pay the crew, and then it gets there a few days while you're putting the slaves on board, haggling over prices or whatever. Then it has to go to North America or even South America or the Caribbean, the Americas generally. So that's a long, fairly hazardous voyage. So again, you've got to feed these slaves. Now, the slaves have to arrive in tip-top condition. A slave in tip-top, a young man, say 20 years old, fit and ready to do heavy work, you can pay $800 for someone in that condition. But there were special buyer agents that would come along, and they would want to look over the slave in close, where they've got to run and jump, they've got to swing from the chandelier, they've got to do handstand. They want to know that this is a super fit dude ready for it. The guy's got to have all his teeth. They even want the guy to have a crap so they can see from the shit an indicator of health and so so it's quite rigorous and detailed is the examiner. If you're going to pay $800, it has to be top drawer. Now, the amount of if the slave's in a poor condition, then they make the decision: how much will it cost me to get this slave back up to health? They're going to have to convalesce for maybe weeks. I've got to pay them. I've got to feed them good quality food. Lots of meat and vegetables and this sort of thing. And that I've got to get. It could take me months to get them up to speed. So I'm not prepared to pay more than $50. So the slave ships had a thing. They were only going to make money if they delivered slaves in top quality health at the other end, tip top health. If people arrived emaciated and obviously sick and seriously fucked up, then no one's going to want to buy them. So then the slaver has the slave ship people who the contractors, whatever. Then they have the job of getting the slaves up to speed and returning them to health. So they've got to do that at their expense, and then try some weeks later to sell them. That's an expensive exercise. The ship's already got to leave, the crew's got to go, they've got to be off somewhere else. All these sorts of things are issues, and there's just no money in it if you deliver slaves that are unfit. So this idea of packing in sardines, not feeding them, whipping them, and so on like that, so that none of them arrived at the other end in anything like a healthy condition. That's bullshit, absolute bullshit. But that's something that they put about. So at the same time as the slaves are all dead through mistreatment, at the same time masses of slaves are also arriving the other end and start work. You can't have both. So those are some of the wider considerations. But it's these claims that there was massive profits made from the colonial empires and that's the cause of white wealth today is absolutely absurd, absolutely ridiculous. And yet the interviews I see, hardly anybody pushes back against the lies that these people push and the lies that they put about that slavery was the sole source of wealth. It wasn't, not even close. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.